Joseph Edward Duncan III was a notorious serial killer and sex offender in the U.S. In 2005, he committed a heinous crime in the Coeur d'Alene, Idaho area, kidnapping and murdering members of the Grond family in a case that shocked the entire country. Before he was arrested, people followed the case closely through the news, hoping the two kidnapped children would somehow survive. In 2005, 8-year-old Shasta Grond lived in Wolf Lodge Bay, a quiet rural village located off Interstate 90, just about 9 miles from Coeur d'Alene. The area is sparsely populated, and few outsiders disturb the peace during the week. Shasta's home is a traditional setup with no dishwasher, washer, or dryer. They use a propane stove for cooking. Despite the simplicity of their living situation, the family enjoys the peace and harmony of the countryside. Every weekend, Shasta's mom, Brenda, and stepdad, Mark, take Shasta and her 2 brothers to a nearby lake to fish, hunt, and have a barbecue. As the youngest child in the family, Shasta demands and receives all the attention she needs. Her brother Slade, 13, promised to protect her forever, and her brother Dylan, a year older, always left her with tasty snacks. On May 15, 2005, Shasta's life changed forever. That night, she felt an inexplicable fear, like there was a stranger hiding in the house. Despite her brother's reassurances that the house was safe and that she didn't need to worry, Shasta was still uneasy. She eventually turned off the lights and went to sleep, confident that her brothers had made her safe. At late night, Shasta and Dylan were woken up by their mom, Brenda, screaming, "There's someone in the house." The 2 kids crept into the living room and saw their stepdad, Mark, and brother Slade tied up with ropes while a strange man with a shotgun ordered Shasta and Dylan to approach. The kids did not hesitate. They went straight to it. The man first tied up their mother with nylon rope, then tied up Shasta and Dylan as well. He left them outside in the yard, where they could hear thumping and moans of pain coming from inside the house in the darkness. A short time later, Slade stumbled out of the house, but was soon dragged back in by the man, who held a blood-stained wooden stick in his hand. Shasta and Dylan were certain that their family was being tortured, and they trembled helplessly as their cries for help were almost impossible to hear in this isolated countryside. After a few minutes, the sounds in the house stopped completely. The man stepped out of the house and told Shasta and Dylan point blank that he had killed their parents and brother. Instead of hurting them, he put them in his open minivan and drove off to Montana. On the way, he switched them over to a red Jeep. Brenda, Mark, and Slade died that night, and Shasta and Dylan's nightmare continued. While driving, the man introduces himself as Joseph and says he's taking them on a camping trip. The man was Duncan, and he'd been planning to take the boys out for a playdate for a while. He'd seen them in their bathing suits playing in their yard just a few days earlier while driving down Interstate 90, and he'd been thinking about them ever since. He'd spent days spying on the family to get their contact info so he could invite them to play, and then killed the remaining 3. After heading to a remote campground, Duncan put them in a secluded cabin where Shasta and Dylan were repeatedly beaten, abused, and sexually assaulted for the next 6 weeks. If anyone had gone into the cabin at that time, they would have heard the 2 children and Duncan screaming that the devil loves to see children abused and crying. But no one came to the cabin and no one could help them. Duncan made 2 strategic moves to evade any potential police presence, choosing remote campsites each time. Despite feeling desperate, Shasta and Dylan remained optimistic, certain that they could find a way to escape. While Duncan was moving the kids, he was looking for beer in the Jeep. The shotgun that was in a box fell out and hit Dylan in the stomach. He let out a pained sound. Duncan hears the sound and picks up the shotgun, firing a shot into Dylan's head. The bullet jams and misses, then continues to fire, killing Dylan instantly. Shasta, who was standing by, went pale, and Duncan turned to her and said, "I'll make this simple. You have 2 choices. I can shoot you or strangle you." Shasta was momentarily speechless, but then replied firmly, "I'll take strangulation." In a later interview, Shasta confidently stated that strangulation would take a while, giving her the opportunity to convince Duncan not to kill her. However, being shot would be a split second. So Duncan got a rope and tied it around her neck. There was no way she could persuade him, and as the strangulation tightened, Shasta suddenly cried out, "Jet, don't kill me." The name Jet was a nickname given to Duncan by his fellow prisoners when he was in prison. When he hears this name, Duncan stops moving, looks surprised at Shasta, and then immediately starts crying. He says that he didn't mean to kill them, he just wanted to free them. Shasta firmly states that she knows he is good and she believes him. At this point, Shasta's brain is racing, and she confidently tells Duncan that she wants to show him the places where she grew up, like her school and the places she used to go because she doesn't have any family left. This makes Duncan feel great. He knows that Shasta trusts him and that he's getting to know her life and her vulnerable side. Shasta's survival tactics are highly effective, and Duncan is eager to take her to her biological father. Before that, though, he's determined to take her to North Dakota to meet his mother and other family members. Shasta said she'd be happy to visit his mother, and the two drove to Coeur d'Alene in northwestern Idaho, where they took a quick break. Duncan asked her if she was hungry and told her to get a milkshake from a fast food restaurant. By the time they walked into a fast food restaurant, Duncan was already picking out food while Shasta was constantly hinting with her eyes at the customer eating next to her. The customer noticed the serious expression on the girl's face and immediately knew something was wrong. After thinking carefully, he recognized her as Shasta, who was kidnapped earlier. Because the police were looking for the murderer as well as the missing Shasta and Dylan, their missing person notices appeared in every corner, and even ordinary people who hadn't been paying attention to the case had some impression of what was going on. The customer promptly went to the waiter, who in turn informed the restaurant manager. They swiftly devised a solution. The waiter brought a coloring book stating that kids love to play with it and gave Shasta some crayons to draw with. When the milkshake was ready, Shasta informed Duncan that the kids in the restaurant had to wear paper crowns for dinner and she was going out to get them. Instead, the customer went to the nearby police station and called the police. A few minutes later, he returned, followed by 2 policemen. They asked Shasta what her name was, but she was not going to be intimidated. She told them her name was Katie. Duncan, who was aware of everything, was gracious enough to say, "It's okay, you can tell him that you are the little girl who was kidnapped." Hearing this, the police immediately handcuffed Duncan and took him into custody. As soon as Shasta was rescued, she was taken to the hospital for specialized care. Given her age, the police sent a professional child psychologist to talk to her. Although Shasta didn't use the word rape, she was strong enough to recall in detail the nightmare that had been happening to her and her brother for 7 weeks. Both Shasta and Dylan were sexually assaulted by him on several occasions over the course of those 7 weeks. Duncan even harassed Dylan in front of her. The things this poor little girl was put through are beyond comprehension even for other children, Investigator Wolfinger stated emphatically. Furthermore, Shasta stated that Duncan had not contacted anyone else during those weeks, indicating that there were no other accomplices. Police also located the hideout where Duncan had been staying with his siblings for nearly 7 weeks, following Shasta's lead. It was a secluded campground in Montana's St. Regis Lolo National Forest, accessible only by a muddy logging trail. It was about an hour's drive from Interstate 90. The campground was small and remote, situated near a steep cliff and in a state of disrepair, with burned tree limbs and empty metal cans scattered throughout. On July 9, 2005, a week after Shasta was rescued, the police found the body of a boy in this camp. The boy was identified as Dylan by police. As the police investigation continued, they uncovered more about Duncan's background. Joseph Edward Duncan III was born on February 25, 1963, in Fort Liberal, North Carolina. He was the 4th of 5 children born to Joseph Edward Duncan Jr. and Lillian Mae Duncan. He is survived by 3 older sisters and a younger brother. Duncan's father served in the U.S. Army, which meant the family moved around a lot, every year or 2 on average. This continued until his father retired in Tacoma, Washington, when Duncan was about 12 years old. Duncan's mother was a bossy woman. After Duncan was arrested for a crime in 1980, he said he'd been abused as a child, but his brother said that wasn't true. In 1979, Duncan's parents separated and divorced in 1983. His sisters left the family, and Duncan chose to stay with his mother while his brother lived with their father. There is no doubt that Duncan has a long history of violent and sexual offenses. His first recorded sexual offense occurred in 1978 when he was 15 years old. In that incident, he pointed a gun at a 9-year-old boy and raped him. The following year, he was arrested for driving a stolen car. He was sent to the Jesse Deslin Boys Ranch in Tacoma for rehabilitation. The Associated Press reported that Duncan told a therapist he had kidnapped and sexually assaulted 6 boys. In 1980, Duncan stole several guns from a neighbor, then kidnapped a 14-year-old boy and raped him at gunpoint. He was rightfully sentenced to 20 years in prison for this crime, but was paroled in 1994 after serving 14 years. While on parole, Duncan lived in a few different places in the Seattle area. In 1996, he was arrested again for marijuana use and released on parole a few weeks later, but with new restrictions. The police were certain that Duncan had killed Samiel White and Carmen Cubias in Seattle in 1996, as well as Anthony Martinez in Riverside County, California. However, the cases remained unsolved without more evidence. Only after his arrest in connection with the Grond case did he admit to both murders. Duncan then broke the rules of his parole, was arrested in Missouri in 1997, and went back to prison. He was released early on July 14, 2000, on good behavior, and moved to Fargo, North Dakota. In March 2005, Duncan was accused of molesting 2 boys at an amusement park in Lake Detroit, Minnesota, on July 3, 2004. On April 5, 2005, he appeared in court in Becker County, and the judge set bail at $15,000. A Fargo businessman helped him pay the bond, but Duncan was not satisfied and fled. On June 1, 2005, a federal warrant was issued for his arrest, charging him with unlawful flight to avoid prosecution. While on the run, he passed Shasta's house and saw her and Dylan. That's when the tragedy unfolded. Duncan made his first court appearance since his arrest on July 5, 2005. He was charged in connection with the kidnapping of Shasta and Dylan. The court was presented with a written transcript of the investigator's conversation with Shasta. Court documents clearly showed that the serial crimes were driven by one goal: to rape, assault, or molest a child under 16. If proven, these charges would have resulted in a death sentence for Duncan under Idaho law. On the 11th, the prosecutor announced that 3 counts of first-degree murder would also be filed against Duncan, that is, the murders of Brenda, Mark, and Slade. Given the gravity of Duncan's actions, the FBI is also investigating unsolved missing child cases nationwide. Notably, one of these murders occurred while Duncan was on parole. On April 4, 1997, Anthony Michael Martinez, then 10 years old, was playing with friends in the front yard of his home in Beaumont, Riverside County, California. An unidentified man approached him and said he was looking for a missing cat. When the boys refused to help, the man threatened them and took Anthony by force at knife point and threw him into his car. After a 2-week search, Anthony's body was found on April 19th, naked and partially decomposed. Investigators confirmed that he had been sexually assaulted and bound with duct tape. Despite a composite sketch of the suspect and partial fingerprints taken from the duct tape found on Anthony's body, the case remained open at the time. Investigators noticed striking similarities between Duncan and the composite sketch in Anthony's case, as well as between Duncan's car and the vehicle driven by the assailant in Anthony's case. The FBI and the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children got involved and contacted the Riverside County authorities. The fingerprints taken from Anthony matched those of Duncan. On August 3rd, the Riverside County Sheriff officially announced that Duncan was connected to Anthony's case. Furthermore, federal prosecutors stated that Duncan also confessed during the trial to murdering 11-year-old Samia White and her 9-year-old sister Carmen Cubias. The girls disappeared on July 6, 1996, after leaving the Crest Motel in Seattle, Washington. Their bodies were found on February 10, 1998, in Bothell, Washington. Duncan's trial was delayed several times due to legal issues. It was originally scheduled to start on January 17, 2006, but was postponed twice, and finally set for October 26th. The defense requested this, and the judge wanted to ensure everything was ready. At the time, the judge stated that a retrial would be unnecessary due to inadequate preparation. On October 16, 2006, shortly after the jury selection process began, the Kootenai County prosecutor entered into a plea agreement with Duncan's attorney. In exchange for a sentence of 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, Duncan pleaded guilty to all state charges. The sentencing on the 3 murder charges was postponed until after the federal trial. If Duncan was not sentenced to death at the federal trial, he would be returned to Kootenai County to stand trial on the state murder charges. On January 18, 2007, Duncan was indicted by a federal grand jury in Coeur d'Alene on 10 counts of kidnapping, kidnapping resulting in death, aggravated sexual abuse of a minor, sexual exploitation of a child resulting in death, as well as unlawful possession of a firearm and vehicle theft. He was arraigned in federal court in Boise, Idaho, and a March 2008 trial was scheduled. However, Duncan's defense attorney requested a continuance, and a new trial date of January 22, 2008 was set. On December 3, 2007, Duncan pleaded guilty to all 10 federal charges. As part of the plea agreement, Shasta was not required to testify during the penalty phase of the trial. The penalty phase of Duncan's federal trial began on August 13, 2008. After 3 hours of deliberation, the jury recommended the death penalty on August 27, 2008. The judge sentenced Duncan to death for 3 counts of kidnapping resulting in death, sexual exploitation of a child. The charges included resulting in death and use of a firearm in the commission of a crime of violence resulting in death in connection with Dylan's death. On November 3, 2008, Duncan was sentenced to death. He was also sentenced to 3 federal life sentences for kidnapping Shasta and sexually abusing Shasta and Dylan. California indicted Duncan for Anthony's murder on January 18, 2007. Despite efforts by Riverside County officials to extradite Duncan to California, including an appeal by Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger, however, Duncan's federal trial needed to be prioritized until he was extradited to California on January 24, 2009, 5 months after he was sentenced to death in the federal court. On March 15, 2011, Duncan pleaded guilty to Anthony's murder. As part of the plea agreement, he accepted a sentence of life imprisonment with no possibility of parole or appeal. Riverside County District Attorney Paul Zellerbach stated that he had spoken with the Anthony family, and they had requested that the case be closed. He also asserted that he believed the federal system would execute Duncan before the state of California would seriously consider it. Duncan also has a blog called The Fifth Nail, where he boldly discusses what it's like to be a sex offender. Duncan also makes the rather unusual point throughout his blog that sex offenders are victims themselves. He argues that oftentimes, offenders don't even realize that their actions are hurting others. Duncan also plays the victim when talking about his own offenses. He states, "I myself have been sexually assaulted multiple times by different people, so when I fight back, I know I'm doing the right thing." Sometimes Duncan keeps a sort of journal writing about his daily life and things like his first skiing trip and the few cats he has. He also talks about his biggest dream, which is to go back to prison. Despite denying he's a rapist, Duncan's blog proves he's done some terrible things. He also expressed his frustration with the Fargo Police Department, who wrongly suspected him of involvement in a child molestation case in Detroit in July 2004 and searched his home the previous August. That left Duncan terrified and starting to lose sleep. He wrote, "They said a rapist in a red car did it, and I am a rapist, also in a red car." On May 11th and 13th, 2005, Duncan wrote his last 2 blog posts. In his blog entry on the 11th, he boldly expressed his fear of the devil and made it clear that he felt the devil was forcing him to question his religious beliefs and leading him to destruction. He did not mince words when he mentioned the fear, loneliness, and confusion he feels, and stated that he wants to cut off the source of his pain with the goal of causing as much damage as possible to society and then dying. In his final essay, Duncan openly questions his judgment, admitting he's uncertain about right and wrong. He candidly discusses his mother's distress over his repeated troubles. He also states that he is writing an encrypted diary in the hope that one day people will be able to decipher it so they can truly understand what kind of person he is. He wants people to understand that even though he may have done some bad things, he is not a bad person. He blames society for infecting him with a very harmful virus. Duncan died on March 28, 2021, at the age of 58, due to complications from brain cancer. His death has sparked a lot of discussion and reaction. Based on what we've seen in the media and how people have reacted, it's clear that Duncan's death is a painful reminder and the end of a nightmare for many of the families affected. After Duncan died, some of the victims' families shared their feelings. For instance, Anthony's mother, Diana, stated emphatically, "The sun is brighter today, and my soul is lighter. The world is a more beautiful place without the evil presence of Duncan. God chose to allow him to suffer for a long time as his end, and I believe it was fitting because of the horrific death that consumed him." Shasta, the girl who survived Duncan's atrocities, also released a statement. She said, "I've been trying not to hate that man for a long time. Today I woke up feeling like my soul was finally free, and I expect others affected by Duncan to wake up feeling the same way." The Kootenai County Sheriff's Office, which is investigating the case, also released a statement. It said, "In May 2005, the Grond family living in the Wolf Lodge Bay Area was brutalized by a serial killer who was passing through our community. The family was stalked, attacked, and tortured. This was one of the worst tragedies Idaho has ever seen.